Hey, welcome to the final lecture of this course, and this is going to be on the social psychology of intergroup conflict. Protestants fighting one another in Northern Ireland over government control over the region. Palestinians and Israelis killing one another over land and water rights in Israel. The Hatfields and McCoys killing each other over in the Appalachian Mountains. A University of Toledo student punches an NIU student in the face. Members of one sorority spread nasty rumors that members of a rival sorority have sexually transmitted diseases. Members of the so-called religious right take control of a state legislature and pass laws that discriminate against LGBTQ peoples. A white businessman decides to not hire any black people. What do these situations all have in common? Well, what they all have in common is that they are all examples of what social psychologists call intergroup conflict, which refers to situations in which a group fights with another group. The conflict that takes place between groups in intergroup conflict takes many forms. Of course, you can have outright physical aggression between groups, such as when a skinhead physically attacks a person of color or a member of Al Qaeda blows himself up in an Iraqi marketplace. However, the conflict can also take non-physical aggressive forms, such as when one high school clique spreads nasty rumors about a rival high school clique, or when a group seizes political control of a nation and passes laws that put rival groups at a disadvantage. It can also take the form of prejudice and discrimination against members of particular groups of people, as when whites discriminate against blacks and Latinos in the United States. As you can tell from the examples I gave, intergroup conflict occurs in many societies. Intergroup conflict is especially prominent in contemporary Western societies such as the United States. This is because these societies, due to globalization and immigration, have many different types of social groups. For example, the United States has citizens in just about every ethnic, religious, and national group that exists on the planet. The more different types of groups exist in a society, the higher the likelihood of intergroup conflict occurring. Social psychologists have investigated intergroup conflict for quite some time. As you might imagine, social psychologists are interested in studying intergroup conflict because they are interested in finding out ways to lessen intergroup conflict. As history and current events show, intergroup conflict can lead to many negative outcomes, from social rejection to outright physical violence that leads to injuries and death. Overall, social psychologists have come up with 7 different explanations for why intergroup conflict occurs. We'll discuss each of these explanations. As you'll see, some of them are better than others. Also, we shouldn't necessarily think of these explanations as mutually exclusive. That is, several of these explanations could partly explain the same instance of intergroup conflict, and some of these explanations may be better than others at explaining some instances of intergroup conflict. Now, one explanation given for intergroup conflict is authoritarian personality. Some social psychologists argue that people with authoritarian personalities are more prone to participate in intergroup conflict than those without authoritarian personalities. A person with an authoritarian personality is a person that is extremely obedient to authority and is quite intolerant of people who are not obedient to authority. People end up with authoritarian personality traits through socialization. Socialization practices that are harsh and disciplinarian tend to produce adults with authoritarian personalities. This makes a lot of sense, of course. If a person experiences harsh and disciplinarian socialization, it would have been in her best interest to strictly obey the commands of authority figures. Eventually, she would internalize the norms of always obeying authority, making it a part of her personality. The authoritarian personality explanation for intergroup conflict isn't that great of an explanation for intergroup conflict, though. The idea behind this explanation is that people with authoritarian personalities are likely to start up conflict with social groups that are not obeying authority figures. For example, the authoritarian personality explanation for intergroup conflict would suggest that white supremacist groups such as the KKK and the alt-right are just made up of a bunch of people with authoritarian personalities that are upset that racial minority social groups are challenging the authority of whites in American society. But there's little evidence for this explanation. Yes, we can differentiate people based on how many authoritarian personality traits they have. Some have a lot, some have a few. However, there is little evidence that those with many authoritarian personality traits are more prone to engage in intergroup conflict than those with few authoritarian personality traits. For instance, if you gave a personality test to members of the alt-right, you're bound to find a wide range of a number of authoritarian personality traits held. Some of them will have few, some will have a lot. Another explanation for intergroup conflict comes from evolutionary social psychologists. These social psychologists argue that kin selection is at the root of intergroup conflict. As you'll hopefully remember, kin selection is the favoring of those who share one's genes over those who do not. This is because doing so helps one pass one's genes on to the next generation. That is, helping your sister or your cousin survive, directly or indirectly, helps pass on your genes to the next generation, since these individuals share more of your genetic material than people genetically unrelated to you. On the African savanna, where modern humans first emerged, humans tended to roam around in tribes and clans where they were all genetically kin to one another. Cousins tended to marry cousins, which is still practiced in many cultures around the world, and doesn't produce as much genetic deformities as popular culture would have you believe. These early human groups, like human groups today, used visual and linguistic symbols to identify their groups. That is, they used visual markers like a picture of a kangaroo or a flag or a particular tattoo design and tribal names so as to be able to identify members of the group from non-members. This was needed because it is often very difficult and many times impossible to identify an individual as belonging or not belonging to a group without the use of these identifiers. According to evolutionary social psychologists, early humans favored those in their in-groups, that is, the groups that they belonged to, because they shared more genes with them than those in out-groups, that is, groups they did not belong to. Scarce resources in ancestral environments meant that those who favored in-group members over out-group members were more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. For example, let's say that we had two early humans. One of these humans would share his resources with anyone, while the other human would only share with people who were his genetic kin. The human who would only share with his genetic kin would be able to give more resources to his genetic kin than the human who shared with anyone, since the person who shared with anyone would have his resources stretched too thin. Thus, the kinfolk of the person who would only share resources with his genetic kin stood a better chance of survival and a better chance at reproducing than the genetic kin of the universal sharer. Conflict with other groups over resources occurred in the ancestral environment because helping other groups didn't help a person's genes propagate into the next generation. There was not a lot to be had on the African savanna. Food was hard to get and it was precious. Thus, when early humans came upon a food source, they were very protective of it and would only let members of the in-group have access. If members of an out-group tried to gain access to this resource, and they often did, conflict would ensue. Now, because of all this, we humans today have inherited the tendency to favor in-group members over outgroup members because this tendency helped our ancestors propagate their genes into the next generation. As with our early human ancestors, we still use visual and linguistic symbols to differentiate in-groups from out-groups, even though now this often has nothing to do with genetic kinship. For example, most Americans are not kin to one another unless you go way, way back. But Americans nevertheless tend to favor Americans over other people of other nationalities. So, intergroup conflict happens in the contemporary world because of humans' tendencies to favor in-groups over out-groups, even though it often has nothing to do now with the passing of genes on to the next generation. This is somewhat bad news for getting rid of intergroup conflict, though. Since the tendency to favor one's in-group over out-groups is in our genes, so to speak, it is at times hard to override. It can be, though, but only with effort. Another explanation given for intergroup conflict is realistic group conflict theory. The gist of this theory is that intergroup conflict occurs when social groups fight over what are called zero-sum resources. Zero-sum resources are resources that diminish for some if they increase for others, and vice versa. For example, consider a situation in which there are only 3 jobs and no more will be added. If one person gets a job, that means other people have less of a chance to get a job. Thus, a zero-sum resource is something which is finite, and the more people take from it, the less chance others have of getting some. When resources are actually, or even just perceived to be zero-sum, groups will often fight with one another over access to this resource. A current example of this is a lot of the anti-immigration sentiment we see in our country today. A lot of native-born Americans have very negative attitudes towards immigrants and want to pass laws preventing them from entering the country or put up large walls along the U.S. border because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that immigrants are taking away scarce jobs from native-born citizens. Also, European attitudes toward Middle Eastern immigrants have become increasingly negative and hostile in recent years, as can be seen by the fact that many European countries have outlawed the building of new Islamic mosques and minarets. Much of this attitude, many argue, comes from Europeans' perceptions that Middle Eastern immigrants are taking away jobs from Europeans, and that Middle Eastern immigrants are getting all the great benefits of living in Europe, like health care and great social services, without having put in the tax dollars that pay for these benefits. Realistic group conflict theory as an explanation of intergroup conflict was famously shown in the Eagles versus Rattlers experiment, an experiment done with well-adjusted, academically successful, middle-class boys ages 11 to 12. The researchers wanted all the children to be pretty much the same so that any conflict they saw would be because of conflict over scarce resources and not because of other factors like race or gender or socioeconomic status or personality differences. When the boys arrived at the summer camp, the researchers randomly assigned the boys to one of 2 groups, the Eagles or the Rattlers. The researchers then had the 2 groups compete with one another in competition for prizes. The prizes were zero-sum. If one group won, that means the other group didn't win and they didn't get the prize. The researchers found that during these competitions, the 2 groups became very hostile toward one another. Members of each group didn't want to have anything to do with members of the other group. Also, derogatory name-calling, physical fights, and raids on other groups' cabins increased, as well as negative stereotypes about the other group. So, conflict over scarce resources, as the researchers predicted, led to increased levels of conflict between the groups. This was especially surprising given that the groups didn't have a history with one another, unlike most other real-world groups. They were pretty much all the same except for their group membership, and the zero-sum prizes they were fighting over weren't a life-or-death thing, unlike other zero-sum resources like jobs or food. Another explanation for intergroup conflict is group threat theory. Because of the history of unequal power relations between groups in a particular society, dominant groups come to believe that certain resources belong exclusively to them. That is, people who belong to dominant groups develop this sense of entitlement that certain resources belong to them. This has and is still continuing in the United States today. Whites, especially white males, have and continue to have a privileged place in our society, and thus white men often develop a sense of entitlement towards particular resources. Currently, you see this when white men complain that immigrants are coming to America to take quote unquote our jobs. The use of the phrase our jobs indicates that these people believe that they have first dibs, so to speak, toward employment, even though they have no inherent right to employment. White men also did this when blacks began to move to the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest in the 20th century, and when women started to enter the workforce in large numbers in the 1970s. Now, according to this explanation, intergroup conflict occurs when dominant groups feel their privileged positions threatened by historically dominated groups. Again, this was the case for whites, especially white males, historically and currently in American society. The picture I showed at the beginning of this lecture was a picture from the 1980s busing riots that occurred in Boston. These riots occurred after a judge ruled that schools in the Boston area had to use busing to make schools in the area equal in terms of racial makeup. Because of racist residential segregation, black children tended to be in schools with limited resources, and white children tended to be in schools with much resources. This was a way to spread the wealth of school funding, as it were. So why did these riots occur? Well, according to group threat theory, these riots occurred because whites had developed this sense of entitlement to good schools and education for their children. When the law demanded that a historically dominated group, i.e. blacks, be offered the same good education, many whites saw this as impinging on their privilege, and many responded by attacking blacks in the Boston area. Another explanation given for intergroup conflict is symbolic threat. According to this explanation, intergroup conflict occurs not because groups are fighting over actual resources, but because one group sees another group as violating their values and beliefs. If we look at history and current affairs, it seems that there are many cases where groups fight with one another, not because they are fighting over resources, but because they are trying to impose their values and beliefs on one another. Fights between religious groups seem to be the prime example of this. Catholics fighting with Protestants in Europe since the 1500s, Muslims and Hindus fighting in the Indian subcontinent for centuries, and Christians fighting Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa in the 20th and 21st centuries. All seem to be examples of groups fighting one another because these groups have values and beliefs that are opposed to one another. Many social psychologists are skeptical of this explanation, however, because they argue that if you look closely, intergroup conflict that seems to be over values and beliefs really is about resources, and that groups are just using their values and beliefs to give a moral blanket, as it were, for why they should have access to these resources and why the other groups shouldn't. The U.S. Civil War is a good example of this. The Confederate States argued that they were fighting for quote-unquote states' rights, when in reality it was just the political elite of these states fighting for the right of rich plantation owners to continue to use slave labor. As this example suggests, sometimes groups cite beliefs and values as the reason for engaging in intergroup conflict because it provides a moral justification for their resource-seeking stance. Another explanation given for intergroup conflict is intergroup anxiety. Intergroup anxiety refers to feelings of anxiety and awkwardness in the presence of outgroup members because of uncertainty about how to behave towards them. That is, because of lack of experience with members of certain groups, people develop anxiety about interacting with these individuals. This anxiety often turns into hostile feelings towards members of these groups. These feelings serve as justification for this anxiety. This may be one of the reasons why many white people in America are prejudicial and discriminatory toward black people. Many white people live in neighborhoods and communities with little to no black people in them. This may be because they live in states that have very small black populations like Wyoming or Vermont, or because of racist residential segregation that has served to keep blacks out of white neighborhoods in metropolitan areas like Chicago, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia. Many white folks don't have or don't seek out opportunities to interact with black folks, and when white people are in the presence of black people, they feel anxiety and awkwardness. This anxiety turns into hostility towards blacks, which in turn leads to prejudicial and discriminatory behavior towards blacks. Another explanation given for intergroup conflict is social identity theory. As you'll hopefully remember, social identities are the categories people use to label and define themselves as members of particular social groups, like Catholic or woman or NIU student or Latino. As we already learned during our discussion of the self, people do what they can to maintain their self-esteem. And a good portion of our self-esteem comes from believing that the social groups that we belong to, that is, our social identities, are awesome and wonderful. It is awesome to be a Catholic. It is wonderful to be a woman. It is awesome to be an NIU student. It is wonderful to be Latino. But how exactly do people come to the conclusion that their social identities are awesome and wonderful? They do so by comparing the groups in which they belong to relevant outgroups, or outgroups that share a common theme with the in-group, and that a person can't belong to if they belong to another particular in-group. That is, Catholics compare themselves to Muslims, since both of them share the common theme of religion, and you really can't be Catholic and Muslim at the same time. People don't come to the conclusion that their social identities are wonderful and awesome by comparing their particular identities to unrelated social identities. Catholics don't come to the conclusion that they're wonderful by comparing themselves to women or to Latinos or to NIU students, because comparing Catholics to these groups would be like the proverbial comparing apples to oranges. Not to mention the fact that many women, Latinos, and NIU students themselves are Catholic. Because people are always trying to maintain their self-esteem, people often choose relevant outgroups to compare themselves to that will help them maintain their self-esteem. They often do this by choosing relevant outgroups they believe are inferior to them. This should remind you of the idea of downward social comparisons. These beliefs, of course, don't necessarily have to be true. In fact, most of the time they are not. They just have to be believed. For instance, many Catholics are able to maintain the idea that they are good people by comparing themselves to Muslims, because they tell themselves that they are not as prone to political violence as Muslims are, even though this is by no means the case. Most Muslims are peaceful people, and Catholics have and continue to engage in political violence throughout the world. Sometimes people will even make up things about members of relevant outgroups that make them seem bad so they can feel better about themselves. Because of the need to maintain self-esteem, members of outgroups often criticize, belittle, and denigrate the groups that some people belong to. When these outgroups are sufficiently large, people feel threats to their self-esteem on a regular basis. So, what do they do in these situations? First, they can leave these constantly disparaged groups. For example, since Jews often face constant ridicule from Christians in Europe this during the centuries, many Jews converted to Christianity. Of course, this is easier for some social identities than others. Second, one can try to hide one's membership in a constantly disparaged group. A good example of this were gays staying in the closet, as they say. However, for many disparaged groups, leaving or hiding one's membership is easier said than done. It is very difficult to join another racial group, and many people have no interest in joining another religious group because they believe that their religion is the quote unquote right one. Also, it is hard for members of some racial groups to hide their racial identities from others. So, what do people do here? Well, they engage in conflict with the outgroups that disparage them. This conflict can take many forms. One form of this conflict is try to invert the values of the attributes of this group. That is, making arguments that the attributes of the disparaged group are actually superior to the attributes of those doing the disparaging. This explained the Black is Beautiful movement that began in the 1960s, which involved Black Americans often arguing that the physical features of Africans, people of African descent, were superior to European physical features. You'll also see Muslims do this to Christians, when Muslims argue that they are true monotheists because Christians divide up God into three beings, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and so they are really polytheists. This conflict can also take the form of protest and collective action. A good example of this is the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s and the Black Lives Matter movement that is currently happening. It can also take the form of individual physical violence, as when a member of a disparaged group attacks a person that belongs to a group they feel disparages them. Psychologists have found that intergroup conflict often makes people experience two major cognitive biases. The first of these biases is the illusion of outgroup homogeneity. The illusion of outgroup homogeneity is the tendency for in-group members to overestimate the degree of similarity among outgroup members. Examples of the illusion of outgroup homogeneity are white people can't dance, all blacks are good at athletics, women aren't good at math, and men can't cook. Of course, these are all illusions, since any large social group is going to have a variety of individuals with a variety of talents, skills, personality types, and attributes. This illusion is a widespread tendency. It has been observed in men and women's perceptions of each other, people of different occupations, and between the young and elderly. Social psychologists argue that this illusion occurs because in-group members often have limited to no contact with out-group members. Because of this limited contact, they don't have the opportunity to see the nuances of group members in the out-groups. On the other hand, people tend to see lots of heterogeneity or differences in members of their own groups. That is, while members of out-groups are all the same in many people's minds, members of their own groups are diverse individuals with many different abilities, attributes, and characteristics. Another cognitive bias caused by intergroup conflict is the ultimate attribution error. As you'll hopefully remember, the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate the importance of personal internal factors and to underestimate situational influences as causes of behavior. The ultimate attribution error is the tendency to attribute undesirable acts by members of an outgroup to stable inner dispositions and desirable behavior to external unstable dispositions. The opposite happens for in-groups, where people attribute desired acts by in-group members to stable inner dispositions and undesirable behavior by in-group members to external unstable dispositions. For example, consider a Catholic person. If a Catholic person sees a Protestant doing something undesirable, he would attribute this behavior to an internal disposition of the Protestant, i.e., all Protestants are jerks. However, if he sees a Protestant doing something desirable, he will attribute this behavior to external factors, such as the Protestant had to do something desirable because of peer pressure. However, the opposite would be the case when the Catholic makes attributions about a fellow Catholic. When a fellow Catholic does something undesirable, the Catholic is more likely to attribute this behavior to external factors, such as peer pressure. Conversely, when a fellow Catholic does something desirable, the Catholic is more likely to attribute this behavior to internal factors, e.g., all Catholics are nice and kind. Of course, a major consequence of these cognitive biases caused by intergroup conflict is that they contribute to the continuation of intergroup conflict. Because of the illusion of outgroup homogeneity, people often don't want to interact with members of outgroups in any engaged way because they believe members of outgroups are all bad apples who can't be trusted or reasoned with. Because of the ultimate attribution error, people continue to see members of outgroups as fundamentally bad people who are not worthy to interact with. Now, the vast majority of the time, intergroup conflict is bad and something we don't want to happen because it leads to a variety of negative consequences for individuals and for society as a whole. But are there ways to end or at least lessen intergroup conflict? For some social psychologists, the answer is no. That is, some social psychologists believe that there will always be intergroup conflict because humans just have the tendency to favor in groups over out groups, no matter what these in groups and out groups are made of. Whether it is because of evolution or because we want a positive social identity or perhaps a little bit of both. We tend to like people who belong to the groups that we belong to and dislike people who belong to the groups that we do not belong to. However, there are some social psychologists who see hope in ending or lessening intergroup conflict. Overall, social psychologists have found support for two ways to end intergroup conflict. First, some social psychologists argue that one way to reduce intergroup conflict is by introducing into an intergroup conflict situation superordinate goals. A superordinate goal is a goal in which groups have to work together to achieve. The summer camp experiment with the Eagles and Rattlers showed how superordinate goals can reduce intergroup conflict. When the conflict between the Eagles and the Rattlers was at its peak, the researchers introduced several goals that involved shared needs and could only be reached by both groups teaming up with one another. For one of these goals, the researchers intentionally broke down the system that supplied water to both groups. For another, they got the food truck stuck in the mud. What the researchers found was that the conflict between the groups was reduced tremendously after introducing these superordinate goals. That is, the Eagles and the Rattlers, after having to work together to reach particular goals, became friendlier toward one another and stopped fighting one another. Superordinate goals work to reduce intergroup conflict in three ways. First, superordinate goals work to reduce intergroup conflict by developing cooperative interdependence between groups. By creating a goal for all, friction between groups disappears. If people have to rely on members from the outgroup to reach a goal, then fighting with these people does people no good and actually is detrimental to one's own and one's group's self-interest. Second, superordinate goals work to reduce intergroup conflict by increasing interactions between in-group members and out-group members. Increased interactions help reduce stereotyping of outgroups and helps people form emotional bonds with outgroup members. When people actually interact with people from an outgroup, they usually find out that their stereotypes about them are wrong. Also, increased interaction also increases the odds that people will become friends, as we've already learned. Third, superordinate goals work to reduce intergroup conflict by creating new superordinate social identities. The creation of a superordinate social identity helps destroy the previous distinctions that existed between in-groups and out-groups. Social psychologists find that superordinate goals produce gradual, not immediate change in intergroup relations. Thus, if the superordinate goal is one that is easily achieved, it probably won't do much to reduce intergroup conflict. It has to be something that's hard to get, that takes a while to get, because it has to make these rival groups work together over an extended period of time. Of course, actual superordinate goals that two antagonistic groups have to work at together rarely exist in real life. Also, even when there is a goal that could be easily achieved by teaming up with outgroups, people often will not do so because of existing prejudices with outgroups. They will often cut off their noses to spite their faces, as it were. Also, even if superordinate goals work to create a superordinate identity that brings two or more groups together, that often means that there will just be a new set of outgroups to conflict with. For instance, if all the racial and ethnic groups in America came together under the superordinate identity of American, they would then often start conflict with members of other nations. Another idea for reducing intergroup conflict is by increasing intergroup contact between rival groups. Social psychologists who argue for the intergroup contact hypothesis, as it's called, argue that increased contact between groups will reduce bias and antagonism between groups. For example, if one wants to reduce the conflict between whites and blacks in American society, one has to create situations where there will be increased contact between members of these two groups. Those who argue for this say that because intergroup contact increases the amount of interactions between members of rival groups, individuals come to realize that they share a lot in common with members of rival groups and start developing empathy for their particular predicaments. There is mixed empirical support for this hypothesis. Sometimes intergroup contact will lead to better relations between rival groups. However, sometimes intergroup contact can also escalate conflict between groups. This makes sense if you think about it. In many areas of the country, such as the U.S. South, blacks and whites have and continue to have constant contact and interaction with each other on a daily basis. Yet relations between these two races are still constrained and often conflictual. When will intergroup contact between rival groups lead to less intergroup conflict? Well, only when these four specific conditions have been met. First, there has to be close and intimate contact between members of rival groups, and this contact must be sustained over an extended period of time. If this doesn't happen, then intergroup contact will not reduce intergroup conflict. Just putting members of rival groups near one another in physical space is not enough. You have to do something to make them actually talk, interact, and get to know one another. Second, there has to be equal status between in-group members and out-group members. This is extremely hard to do in real life. Because of the historic and cultural factors that tend to favor some groups over others, some groups come into a situation of intergroup contact with the belief that they are simply better than members of the outgroup, and thus have no interest in getting to know or interacting with members of the outgroup, because members of this group are beneath them, so to speak, and aren't worthy to know. It is hard to change this mindset. This is probably the reason why relations between whites and blacks in the U.S. remain strained and conflictual despite constant contact in many parts of the country. Many whites continue to believe that they are superior to blacks, either implicitly or explicitly, and thus they don't care to get to know black folks. Third, there have to be social norms that support equality for intergroup contact to reduce intergroup conflict. If these norms don't exist, then intergroup conflict will continue. This is probably why, despite constant contact, there is still strong racism in the U.S. South, especially during the pre-civil rights era, because there were norms supporting unequal treatment of the races. Finally, there has to be institutional support for intergroup contact. Without this support, different groups often don't come together. This institutional support can come from educational institutions, government institutions, or religious institutions. Educational and government institutions often support racial intergroup conflict in the U.S. through affirmative action policies that support the hiring of racial and ethnic minorities. Religious institutions often support for intergroup conflict through having religious services and ceremonies that are open to all races and ethnicities. And so that is it. That is the last lecture for this course. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something, and we'll see you around. Bye-bye.